The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Sterling and Associates marketing agency as I walked through the bustling lobby. My worn canvas sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished surface, drawing a few glances from the impeccably dressed employees rushing past with their designer coffee cups and leather portfolios. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'd been working in the creative development department for 6 months, now deliberately keeping a low profile. Most people assumed I was just another mid-level designer trying to make ends meet. The faded jeans, simple cardigans, and my habit of bringing lunch in brown paper bags only reinforced that impression. "Morning, Sam," called out Trevor, one of the junior copywriters, as he hurried toward the elevators. "Did you finish those mock-ups for the Henderson campaign?" "All ready for the 10 a.m. review," I replied, adjusting the strap of my worn messenger bag. What Trevor didn't know was that those weren't just mock-ups. They were complete campaign strategies that could revolutionize how Sterling approached luxury retail clients. The elevator dinged, and I stepped inside with a handful of other employees. As we rose to the 15th floor, I caught fragments of conversations about weekend plans and project deadlines. Normal workplace chatter. None of them had any idea that the woman standing quietly in the corner owned 47% of the AR company they worked for. "My name is Samantha Sterling. 3 years ago, I inherited this agency from my late father, Richard Sterling. But I'd made a decision that shocked the board of directors. Instead of taking the executive suite immediately, I wanted to understand the business from the ground up. Every department, every process, every challenge that our employees faced daily. You're making a mistake, Samantha." My father's longtime business partner, Charles Morrison, had warned me during that heated board meeting. A CEO needs to lead from the top, not hide in the trenches. But I'd seen too many companies crumble because leadership lost touch with their workforce. I wanted to be different. So I'd enrolled myself as a regular employee under my mother's maiden name, Samantha Chen, and spent the past 3 years rotating through various departments. Marketing, accounting, human resources, client relations. Each position taught me something new about the machine my father had built. The elevator opened on the 15th floor, and I made my way to my desk in the creative department. It was tucked away in a corner, nothing fancy, just a standard workstation with a decent computer and a small plant I'd brought from home. Around me, the department hummed with activity as people prepared for another day of campaigns, presentations, and client demands. That's when I heard the click of high heels on marble, sharp and deliberate. Victoria Blackwood had arrived. Victoria was everything I wasn't in appearance. 6 feet tall in her Louboutin heels, platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon, and a wardrobe that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. She'd been hired 4 months ago as the new creative director, brought in from a competing firm with promises of revolutionary leadership and streamlined efficiency. From day one, Victoria had made it clear that she viewed the existing staff as dead weight that needed to be trimmed. She strutted through the department like a general surveying conquered territory, her steel gray eyes cataloging every perceived weakness and inefficiency. "People!" Victoria's voice cut through the morning buzz like a knife. "Conference room now. We have some important changes to discuss." I gathered my notepad and followed the stream of nervous employees filing into the glass-walled conference room. The space felt smaller when Victoria was in it, her presence somehow managing to suck the oxygen from the air. She positioned herself at the head of the long table, hands planted firmly on the polished surface. "I've been reviewing our department's performance metrics," she began, her voice carrying the kind of cold authority that made people automatically sit up straighter. "And frankly, I'm disappointed." Marcus, one of our senior designers, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Beside him, Jennifer from copywriting stared down at her hands. These were talented people. I'd worked alongside them for months and knew their capabilities firsthand. "Our client retention is down 8% from last quarter," Victoria continued, clicking through a slideshow filled with red highlighted numbers and downward trending graphs. Response rates on campaigns are stagnating, and I'm seeing far too much creative indulgence where we need strategic focus. My jaw tightened. Those numbers were misleading. Victoria was comparing our current performance to an unusually strong quarter from the previous year, when we'd landed 3 major accounts simultaneously. Any statistician would call that cherry-picking data, which brings me to the main issue. Victoria's gaze swept across the room, lingering on each face. Some team members seem to think they know better than management. There's been pushback on new initiatives, resistance to proven methodologies, and frankly, a level of insubordination that I will no longer tolerate. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I could feel the collective anxiety of my colleagues, the way people's shoulders tensed when they sensed a target being painted on their backs. Victoria's eyes locked onto mine. "Samantha Chen, would you stand up, please?" My heart rate remained steady as I rose from my chair. I'd been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since I'd started quietly questioning some of Victoria's more questionable decisions. Like the time she'd wanted to use stock photos for a luxury watch campaign, or when she'd suggested we could streamline client research by using AI-generated demographic data instead of actual market studies. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Victoria said, gesturing toward me like I was a specimen under a microscope. "Yesterday, during our campaign review, Samantha here decided to interrupt my presentation to share her concerns about our Henderson luxury retail strategy." I remembered the moment clearly. Victoria had been pitching a campaign that fundamentally misunderstood Henderson's brand identity, positioning them as accessible luxury when they were actually ultra-exclusive. I'd raised my hand and politely suggested we reconsider the approach, based on the client's actual market position. "What I suggested," I said calmly, "was that we might want to review Henderson's brand guidelines before finalizing the creative direction. Their exclusivity is their main selling point, and the proposed campaign seemed to contradict." "Exactly!" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "This is the insubordination I'm referring to. Second-guessing leadership decisions, undermining confidence in established strategies, and frankly, acting like you know better than people with actual experience in this field." The irony was almost amusing. Victoria's actual experience consisted of 4 months at Sterling & Associates and a previous role at a firm that had lost 3 major clients during her tenure there. I'd done my research before allowing Charles Morrison to hire her. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, her voice gaining momentum, "I've noticed a pattern of behavior that suggests Samantha believes she's entitled to special treatment, taking extended lunch breaks, leaving early on Fridays, and generally acting like the rules don't apply to her." My extended lunch breaks had been client meetings I'd been taking to better understand Sterling's relationship dynamics. The early Friday departures were board meetings I attended under my real identity. But Victoria didn't know that, and I wasn't about to enlighten her. Not yet. "The fact is," Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass, "this department needs team players, not prima donnas who think they know how to run things better than management." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Around the table, my colleagues looked anywhere but at me. I could see the relief in some of their eyes, relief that they weren't in the crosshairs. Others, like Marcus and Jennifer, looked genuinely uncomfortable with what was unfolding, which is why Victoria's voice rose to fill the silence. "I'm terminating Samantha Chen's employment with Sterling & Associates, effective immediately. This kind of disruptive behavior has no place in a professional environment." The words hung in, the air like smoke. I felt the familiar calm that always settled over me during moments of crisis, the same composure that had served me well during hostile takeover attempts and contentious board meetings. "I see," I said quietly, reaching into my bag for the company ID badge I wore as Samantha Chen. And this decision has been approved through proper channels? Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. I don't need approval to remove problematic employees from my department. That's what being a director means, making the hard decisions that improve overall performance. I placed my ID badge on the table with a soft click. The plastic rectangle sat there like a small surrender flag, though surrender was the furthest thing from my mind. "You're making a mistake, Victoria," I said, standing and gathering my things. "But I understand that sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way." "The only mistake," Victoria replied, her voice dripping with satisfaction, "was keeping you around as long as we did. Security will escort you out." As if summoned by her words, 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. I recognized them both, Mike and Doug, good men who'd worked for Sterling and Associates for years. Mike's face was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight apologetic shrug he gave me. "That won't be necessary," I said, slipping my messenger bag over my shoulder. "I know the way out." As I walked toward the door, Victoria's voice followed me. "Let this be a lesson to everyone else. Excellence means following leadership, not questioning it at every turn. We have work to do, and we'll do it better without the dead weight." The conference room door closed behind me with a soft whisper, sealing away the tense silence and Victoria's satisfied smirk. In the hallway, the normal sounds of office life continued. Phones ringing, printers humming, the distant chatter of people who had no idea what had just transpired. I walked slowly toward the elevators, taking in every detail of the department. I'd called home for 6 months. The motivational posters on the walls, the coffee station where people gathered to complain about deadlines, the bulletin board covered with project timelines and team photos. At the elevator bank, I pressed the call button and waited. When the doors opened, I didn't step inside. Instead, I pulled out my personal phone. Not the basic model I'd been carrying as Samantha Chen, but the latest iPhone with the Sterling and Associates executive contact list. I scrolled to Charles Morrison's direct line and hit call. "Charles, it's Samantha," I said when he picked up on the second ring. "We need to talk. Victoria Blackwood just made a very serious error in judgment, and I think it's time to end this experiment." There was a pause on the other end, then a heavy sigh. "She fired you, didn't she?" "She did. And in doing so, she's given us everything we need to know about her leadership capabilities. Can you arrange an emergency board meeting for this afternoon?" "Consider it done." "Samantha, I have to ask. Are you sure you want to do this? Once you reveal who you are?" I looked back toward the conference room where Victoria was probably still basking in her moment of triumph, completely unaware that she'd just fired the person who could make or break her career with a single phone call. "I'm sure, Charles. It's time to stop observing and start leading. 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock. I ended the call and finally stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed and I began my descent to the lobby, I felt a familiar sensation, the same mix of anticipation and determination that had carried me through every major business decision in my life. Victoria Blackwood thought she'd just removed a problem employee. What she'd actually done was wake up a sleeping giant, and she was about to discover just how big a mistake that really was. The Sterling and Associates executive parking garage was a temple of chrome and leather, filled with BMWs, Mercedes, and the occasional Tesla. I walked past them all to my own vehicle, a modest Honda Civic that I'd been driving as part of my undercover routine. But today, I didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat, letting the weight of the morning settle over me. For 6 months, I'd been playing a role, learning about my own company from the inside. Now that experiment was over, and it was time to return to being who I really was. I pulled out my real phone again and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. "Patricia? It's Samantha Sterling. I need you to prepare the boardroom for an emergency meeting at 3 p.m., full board attendance, and make sure you have Victoria Blackwood's employment file ready for review." Patricia Williams had been my father's executive assistant for 15 years before becoming mine. Her voice carried a note of surprise. "Ms. Sterling? I thought you were still in the field research phase of your development program." The research phase just ended rather abruptly. "Patricia, I also need you to pull all performance reports from the creative department for the past 4 months and compile a list of every employee terminated or who resigned since Victoria Blackwood took over as director. Right away. Should I prepare talking points for the board meeting?" I started the car, letting the engine warm up while I considered the question. No talking points necessary. This one's going to be straightforward. The drive home gave me time to think. My apartment was deliberately modest, a 2-bedroom place in a middle-class neighborhood, furnished with pieces from IKEA and Target. It was part of maintaining my cover, but it had also been surprisingly liberating. For 3 years, I'd lived without the pressure of executive expectations, without people analyzing my every decision for hidden meanings or strategic implications. I'd changed out of my department store cardigan and jeans, trading them for a tailored, navy suit that had been hanging unused in my closet. The transformation was more than cosmetic. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I could feel Samantha Chen fading away and Samantha Sterling taking her place. My real office was in the Sterling and Associates Executive Suite on the 32nd floor. I'd maintained it during my undercover period, with Patricia ensuring that all necessary business continued during my absence. The elevator ride up felt longer than usual, each floor carrying me further from the person I'd been that morning, Ms. Sterling. Patricia's face lit up as I stepped into the reception area. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and an efficiency that bordered on telepathic. "It's so good to see you back." "It's good to be back, Patricia. Though I have to admit, the circumstances could be better. Do we have everything ready for the meeting?" "Boardroom's prepared. Victoria Blackwood's file is on your desk, and I've compiled the departmental reports you requested." She paused, her expression growing concerned. "Ms. Sterling, if I may ask, what exactly happened down there?" I accepted the thick folder she handed me and glanced at the contents. Victoria's resume, her performance reviews, and a disturbing pattern of employee departures from the creative department. What happened, Patricia, is that I learned exactly what kind of leader Victoria Blackwood really is. And now, the board is going to learn the same thing. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. I reviewed every document Patricia had compiled, cross-referenced employee complaints that had been filed through HR, and put together a comprehensive picture of Victoria's tenure as creative director. The numbers told a sobering story. In 4 months, the creative department had lost 6 employees, 3 terminations, and 3 resignations. Client satisfaction scores had dropped 12%. Project completion times had increased by an average of 3 days. And most damning of all, 2 major clients had specifically requested that Victoria not be involved in their campaigns. At 2:45 p.m., I gathered the files and made my way to the boardroom. The Sterling and Associates board consisted of 7 members, including myself and Charles Morrison. As I entered the room, I could see that Charles had been busy. Every seat was occupied, and the atmosphere was thick with curiosity. "With us." "And gentlemen," Charles announced as I took my seat at the head of the table, "I'm sure you're all wondering why we've been called together on such short notice. I'll let Samantha explain the situation." I looked around the table at the faces I'd known for years. Margaret Chen, our head of operations and my mother's sister. Robert Hayes, our chief financial officer. Diana Reeves, who'd been my father's closest friend and advisor. These weren't just board members. They were family. "This morning," I began, placing Victoria's file on the table, "Victoria Blackwood terminated my employment for what she called insubordination." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Robert leaned forward in his chair. Diana's mouth fell open. "She fired you?" Diana's voice was barely above a whisper. "She fired the owner." "Of the company?" "She fired Samantha Chen, Mid-level designer, I corrected. She had no idea who I really was. And that, ladies and gentlemen, tells us everything we need to know about Victoria Blackwood's leadership capabilities. I opened the file and began distributing copies of the documents Patricia had prepared. Over the past 4 months, Victoria has created a culture of fear and intimidation in the creative department. Employee turnover has increased by 40%. Client satisfaction has declined significantly. And this morning, she demonstrated a complete lack of judgment and professionalism. Charles cleared his throat. Samantha, walk us through exactly what happened. For the next 20 minutes, I recounted the morning's events in detail. The conference room confrontation, Victoria's accusations of insubordination, and her decision to terminate my employment without consulting HR or following proper procedures. What concerns me most, I concluded, isn't that she fired me. It's how she fired me. The public humiliation, the lack of due process, and the clear enjoyment she derived from the exercise of power. This isn't leadership. It's bullying. Margaret shook her head slowly. I can't believe she actually said your concerns about the Henderson campaign were insubordination. You were absolutely right about their brand positioning. Which brings up another issue, I continued, pulling out a different set of documents. Victoria's strategic decisions have been questionable at best. She's pushed for cost-cutting measures. That compromise quality. She's ignored client feedback that contradicts her vision, and she's systematically silenced anyone who questions her methods. Robert was studying the financial reports with a frown. These numbers don't lie. The creative department's profitability has dropped 8% since she took over, because she's focused on short-term metrics instead of long-term client relationships, I explained. She sees employees as expenses to be minimized rather than assets to be developed. Diana leaned back in her chair, her expression troubled. Samantha, I have to ask, during your time undercover, did you see any examples of Victoria's leadership that were positive? It was a fair question, and I considered it carefully. She's organized, she meets deadlines, and she's not afraid to make difficult decisions. But leadership isn't just about efficiency, Diana. It's about inspiring people to do their best work, creating an environment where creativity can flourish, and building trust with both employees and clients. And Victoria hasn't done that, Charles observed. Victoria has created an atmosphere of fear. People are afraid to speak up, afraid to take creative risks, afraid to challenge ideas that might not be in the client's best interest. That's not leadership. That's management by intimidation. The room fell quiet as the board members absorbed this information. I could see them processing not just Victoria's failures, but the implications of my own deception. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out my final document. This morning, before firing me, Victoria made several statements that suggest she doesn't understand her position within the company hierarchy. She claimed she didn't need approval to terminate employees, and she dismissed the importance of following proper procedures. I distributed copies of the company's HR policies, with relevant sections highlighted. According to our own guidelines, any termination must be approved by HR and documented with cause. Victoria did neither. If I had actually been just another employee, we could be facing a wrongful termination lawsuit. Margaret whistled low. She really doesn't understand how things work, does she? Which is why, I concluded, I'm recommending that we terminate Victoria Blackwood's employment immediately. Not because she fired me, but because she's demonstrated a fundamental inability to lead effectively or follow company policies. The board discussion that followed was intense but brief. Victoria's pattern of behavior was clear, the documentation was thorough, and the decision was unanimous. All in favor of terminating Victoria Blackwood's employment for cause. Charles asked. 7 hands rose around the table. Motion carried, Charles announced. Samantha, how do you want to handle this? I looked at my watch. It was 4:15 p.m. Victoria would still be in the office, probably riding high on her morning victory. I think, I said, standing and straightening my suit jacket, It's time for Victoria to meet the real Samantha Sterling, and I think she deserves to learn about her termination the same way she delivered mine in front of her entire department. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt a sense of completion settling over me. 3 years of observation and learning had led to this moment. Victoria Blackwood thought she'd won the morning by removing a problem employee. She was about to discover that some problems don't disappear when you fire them. They just reveal themselves to be much bigger than you ever imagined. The elevator. Doors opened onto the 15th floor at exactly 4:30 p.m. The creative department was in its usual late afternoon rhythm, people wrapping up projects, preparing for end-of-day meetings, and stealing glances at the clock as they counted down to quitting time. I walked through the familiar space, but everything felt different now. I wasn't Samantha Chen anymore, the quiet designer who kept her head down and brought lunch in brown paper bags. I was Samantha Sterling, owner and CEO of Sterling & Associates, and I carried myself with the authority that position demanded. Several employees looked up as I passed, their faces showing confusion. Marcus did a double take, his eyes widening as he took in my transformation from department store cardigan to tailored business suit. Jennifer actually stood up from her desk, her mouth slightly open. "Samantha?" she called out. How did you get back up here? I thought about security." "There's going to be a meeting," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the department. "Everyone in the conference room, please." The same conference room where Victoria had humiliated me just 6 hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. People began filing toward the glass-walled space, their expressions ranging from confused to concerned. I could hear whispered conversations. Why is Sam dressed like that? How did she get past security? What's going on? Victoria's office door was closed, but I could see her silhouette through the frosted glass, phone pressed to her ear. Probably updating some executive on her successful house-cleaning operation. I knocked once and stepped inside without waiting for permission. Victoria looked up from her call, her face immediately shifting into an expression of outraged authority. "I'm going to have to call you back," she said into the phone, then slammed it down. "What the hell are you doing here? I told security to escort you out." "They did," I replied calmly. "I left, and now I'm back." "Well, you can turn around and leave again. I've already called building security. You're trespassing." I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. Actually, I called building security and told them to stand down. Because, as it turns out, "Victoria, you can't trespass in a building you own." Something in my tone must have penetrated because Victoria's expression shifted from outrage to uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" "Conference room," I said. "There are some things your department needs to know." Victoria's heels clicked sharply on the floor as she followed me out of her office. The conference room was already full, with people standing along the walls when the chairs ran out. The same space that had felt oppressive this morning now hummed with nervous energy. Victoria positioned herself at the head of the table, just as she had during the morning's inquisition. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, Samantha, but—" "Please sit down, Victoria." There was something in my voice that made her pause. For the first time since I'd known her, Victoria Blackwood looked uncertain. I remained standing at the opposite end of the table, looking out at the faces of my colleagues. People I'd worked alongside for months, shared coffee with, collaborated with on projects. They deserved to know the truth. "This morning," I began, "Victoria terminated my employment for what she called insubordination. She did this publicly, in front of all of you, without following proper procedures or consulting with HR." Victoria started to interrupt, but I held up a hand. She also made it clear that she viewed questioning management decisions as unacceptable, that she expected blind obedience rather than collaborative problem-solving, and that she believed fear was an effective leadership tool. The room was absolutely silent now. Even Victoria had stopped trying to speak. "What Victoria didn't know," I continued, "is that for the past 6 months, I haven't been just another employee. My real name isn't Samantha Chen. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the conference table where everyone could see it. The Sterling and Associates logo gleamed in gold foil, and below it, in elegant script, Samantha. Sterling, Chief Executive Officer. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. You're Samantha Sterling. Richard. Sterling's daughter, I am. And for the past 3 years, I've been working in various departments throughout this company under my mother's maiden name, learning about Sterling and Associates from the ground up. Learning what works, what doesn't, and most importantly, learning about the people who make this company successful. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. You are incredible people. Creative, dedicated, talented individuals who pour your hearts into every project. You deserve leadership that recognizes and nurtures that talent, not someone who tries to rule through intimidation. Victoria's face had gone completely white. She was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had turned bloodless. This morning, I continued, Victoria demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that destroys teams and drives away talent. She made it clear that questioning authority was grounds for termination, that following procedures was optional, and that public humiliation was an acceptable management tool. I pulled out the folder I'd brought from the board meeting and placed it on the table. Over the past 4 months, this department has lost 6 talented employees. Client satisfaction has declined. Project timelines have increased. And this morning, Victoria added wrongful termination to her list of management failures. You can't... Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. You can't be serious. You were just an employee, a problem employee that I removed. I turned to face her directly. Victoria, 20 minutes ago, the Sterling and Associates Board of Directors voted unanimously to terminate your employment for cause. Your last day is today. The words hit her like a physical blow. Victoria's carefully constructed mask of authority crumbled completely, and I watched as the reality of her situation sank in. No, she whispered then louder. No, this isn't possible. I'm the creative director. I have a contract. You can't. I can, and I have. I kept my voice level, professional. Your employment is terminated effective immediately for violations of company policy, failure to follow proper procedures, and creating a hostile work environment. Victoria stood up so fast her chair rolled backward into the glass wall. This is insane. You deceived everyone. You lied about who you were. I used my mother's maiden name to learn about my own company, I replied calmly. There's nothing illegal or unethical about that. However, publicly humiliating an employee, failing to follow termination procedures, and claiming authority you don't actually possess, those are problems. The breakdown was complete now. Victoria's perfect composure shattered like glass, and I could see tears of rage and humiliation forming in her eyes. I was trying to improve this department, she said, her voice breaking. These people were underperforming, resistant to change. I was brought in to fix things. You were brought in to lead, I corrected. Instead, you ruled. There's a difference. Marcus raised his hand tentatively. Ms. Sterling, does this mean? It means we're going to rebuild this department the right way, I said, with leadership that values collaboration over control, creativity over conformity, and respect over fear. I looked around the room one more time, then focused on Victoria, who was still standing at the far end of the table, her entire world having collapsed in the span of 10 minutes. Victoria, Patricia Williams in the executive suite has prepared your final paperwork. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. As if summoned by my words, Mike from security appeared in the doorway. His face was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight nod he gave me. Recognition, respect, and perhaps a little admiration. Victoria gathered what remained of her dignity and walked toward the door. Just before she reached it, she turned back. "You planned this," she said, her voice a mixture of accusation and defeat. "This whole thing was a setup." "No, Victoria. This whole thing was a test, and you failed." After Victoria left, escorted by security and carrying a small box of personal items, the conference room remained silent for several long minutes. Finally, Jennifer spoke up. "So, what happens now?" I pulled out a chair and sat down, deliberately choosing not to take Victoria's position at the head of the table. "Now we rebuild," I said. "I'm going to be transitioning back to my executive role, which means we need to find a new creative director. Someone who understands that leadership means supporting your team, not intimidating them." Marcus leaned forward. "Are you taking applications?" The question drew a few nervous laughs, breaking some of the tension. "I am, actually. But more than that, I want to hear from all of you about what kind of leadership you need. What would help you do your best work? What would make this department not just functional, but exceptional?" For the next hour, we talked, really talked, in a way that hadn't been possible under Victoria's reign of fear. People shared ideas, voiced concerns they'd been afraid to mention, and began sketching out a vision for what the creative department could become. As the meeting wound down and people began filtering back to their desks, Marcus approached me. "Ms. Sterling, Samantha, I have to ask. When Victoria was tearing you down this morning, how did you stay so calm?" I considered the question. "Because I knew something she didn't. I knew that sometimes the person you're trying to crush has more power than you realize. And I knew that patient observation is often more valuable than immediate retaliation. So this was all research for you?" "The research was real," I said. "But Marcus, what happened this morning wasn't planned. Victoria made her own choices, revealed her own character. I just made sure there were consequences for those choices." As evening settled over the city, I found myself back in my real office, on the 32nd floor. The view from here was spectacular. The entire city spread out below, lights beginning to twinkle as darkness fell. Patricia knocked and entered with a cup of tea and a stack of messages. "How did it go?" she asked. Victoria's "Gone. The department is stabilizing, and we have a lot of work ahead of us," I replied. "Any word from the board?" Charles called. "He said to tell you welcome back, and that your father would be proud." I leaned back in my chair thinking about my father. Richard Sterling had built this company from nothing, growing it into one of the most respected marketing agencies in the city. He'd always believed that business was about people, serving clients, supporting employees, and building something that would last. "Patricia, I want to schedule individual meetings with every employee in the creative department over the next 2 weeks. I need to understand what damage Victoria did and how we can fix it." "Already on your calendar," she replied with a smile. "Is there anything else you need tonight?" I looked out at the city lights, then back at the stack of messages on my desk. There would be calls to return, decisions to make, and a department to rebuild. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. "Just one more thing," I said. "Draft a company-wide memo. I want everyone to know that I'm resuming my executive duties full-time and that Sterling and Associates is committed to creating a workplace where everyone can do their best work without fear of retaliation or intimidation." Patricia nodded and turned to leave, but I stopped her. "And Patricia, make sure the memo mentions that we welcome questions, concerns, and constructive feedback from all employees. Real leadership isn't about silencing dissent, it's about learning from it." After she left, I sat alone in my office, processing the events of the day. This morning I'd been Samantha Chen, the quiet designer who kept her head down and did good work. Tonight I was Samantha Sterling, CEO of a company that employed over 300 people. the transformation wasn't just about changing clothes or revealing my identity. It was about taking responsibility for the culture and values of the organization my father had built. Victoria Blackwood had thought she could rule through fear and intimidation. She'd been wrong about a lot of things, but her biggest mistake was assuming that power always flows downward. Sometimes, the person you're trying to crush has the power to crush you right back. And sometimes, the quiet employee in the corner office knows a lot more than you think. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't used in 6 months, my personal driver. James? It's Samantha Sterling. I'm ready to come home, The elevator carried me down to the executive parking garage. I thought about the lesson Victoria had learned today. Leadership isn't about the title on your business card or the size of your office. It's about how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. The problem is, you never know who's watching, and you never know when that quiet person in the corner might turn out to be the most important person in the room. My BMW was waiting where I'd left it that morning, gleaming under the garage lights. As I drove through the city toward my real home, the penthouse apartment I'd barely seen during my 3 years undercover, I felt a sense of completion. The experiment was over. The research phase had ended with Victoria's spectacular failure of leadership. Now it was time to use everything I'd learned to build something better. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.